Fallout 4 sucks at telling a cohesive, long-form story. Stick with me. Let me paint you a picture. The world ends. The life you'd known for decades destroyed in seconds. A chance at rebuilding it all turns out to not be exactly what you'd expected, but you survive, helpless as you may be. And then, your family is pulled apart, literally taken before your eyes. You can do nothing. Nothing to stop everything you love from dying again. Nothing but claw your way back into the sunlight, into the scorched corpse of an entire planet, searching for vengeance. You know it's there. You know he's somewhere. You can feel it. But then you get distracted and spend 8 weeks building half a dozen wooden shacks and rummaging through everything with an inside for antique superglue. Welcome to Fallout 4, a game so slaveringly anticipated that the collected fan vibrations could have powered an idyllic suburb till doomsday. Riding high on a pedigree of sprawling maps, intricate plot lines, and worlds built thicker than cold gravy, Bethesda promised folks everything they could stomach and more. But here's the thing. Fallout 4 sucks at telling a cohesive, long-form story. As a player, you're immediately confronted with an uncomfortable choice. Follow the breadcrumbs for morsels of a lovingly crafted story, or detour every half hour to bathe in the world while the main plots go cold. But that's what makes Fallout 4 so great. There's so much to choose from. The world is so expansive, so rich that the player is the one in control of the experience. It's a chance for the end user to decide what they get. That's the problem. See, the world is expansive. Massive. There are more nooks and crannies than an English muffin, and the temptation to go spelunking on a whim is overwhelming to the point of chronic sidetracking. And while this means literal ass tons of story, it means that a long, cohesive narrative suffers. So consider the following. Fallout 4 presents both a central narrative and a wealth of side content. The additional storytelling, side quests, and information placed around the world offer dozens of opportunities an hour to break away from the main storyline and explore. Which wouldn't be so bad if it didn't mean that Fallout 4 constantly breaks its own pace and immersion. By offering such a staggering variety and content to the player, the game sort of shoots itself in the narrative foot. Every time player attention shifts to a new task or topic, it has to be diverted from somewhere else. If you want the player to be invested in your core narrative, emotionally, intellectually, or otherwise, they need the mental breathing room to do that. If you want the player to feel the visceral need to retrieve their child, don't present them with a half a dozen fetch quests and a Sims clone within the first 30 minutes. Conversely, if players are expected to be engaged in a constant influx of smaller, more compact stories, allow them to focus on that. Yes, of course, an overarching plot would be necessary to tie those stories together, but a more passive approach, perhaps where the player is comparatively insignificant to the events at large, would seem like a more appropriate thematic choice. As an aside, none of this is to say that an audience is incapable of switching gears mid-story. All fiction does this to an extent. It's why we have smash cuts in film and don't spend the first 80 pages of any given novel describing Minnesota before we meet our characters. My point is that rattling a viewer or player works best when done with deliberate, calculated intent. And all of this leads me to my assertion that, as it exists, Fallout 4 cannot be considered a solidly constructive, cohesive, long-form narrative experience. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but with its massive scale and abundance of story information available to the player, Fallout 4 is simply too large of a sandbox to play in. That is, if the end goal is a directed experience start to end. More experienced folks than myself have explained a lot more about game writing in better ways, so I won't go too deeply here, but let me break the topic down for the sake of argument. Storytelling in games comes in a lot of different flavors, but the two I feel are most prevalent in Fallout 4 seem to be 1. Directed narrative, and 2. Passive narrative. That first type, directed narrative, would be when the designers, or in the case of movies, the director, or in novels, the author, take you by the hand and guide you through a story. They're an outside force that chooses what the audience experiences, how long they experience it, and in what context those experiences are received. Their job is not to tell you how to experience their work, but they are certainly in charge of coloring the way those experiences reach you. This is where Fallout 4's main storyline camps out. The quest for Sean, the dealings with the factions, and everything else rolled up in that particular package. The Bethesda folks make it their goal, when you follow their plot, to control, to the best of their abilities, how you feel about playing in their sandbox. Consider the context in which you first meet Preston and the remaining Minutemen, in a desperate shootout fighting for their lives, or dialogue. Even in moments where your choices seem to be totally under your control, your options, and your responses are formulated in a way that furthers the narrative agenda of a force outside of your control. Another note, a lot of the side quests fall into this category as well, but due to the manner in which they're made available to the player, they fit more easily under the passive narration umbrella. It's a very squares or rectangles argument. Smack all this alongside number 2 and the differences become more obvious. The passive narration is just that, passive. It waits in the wings, with all the same considerations as a direct narrative, but it tends to be more optional. It comes out to play if you knock on the door, decked out and ready to go with a second punch of direct storytelling right to the face, but only if you ask for it. This is the sort of thing we experience when we start bumbling by NPCs and stepping into their lives. Think helping the Diamond City caretaker scavenge paint in the ruins of Boston, or tracking down lost antique baseball memorabilia in the flooded suburbs. These are stories, directed, colorful stories, but the only way a player engages with these narrative threads is if they make the active choice to get involved. And what this leaves us with is a well-constructed story told in a disjointed way. A story that deserves deliberate pacing is constantly speed-bumped by its own supplements. We, as an audience, are never given the chance to fully settle into the plot tracks. Even if our actual indulgence in the diversions is minimal, the temptation is there, bombarding our concentration and wheedling away at the attention a focused story demands. But almost every game does this. Having subplots running beneath the main plot is an established, effective, and expected tenet of all long-form fiction. Oh, totally. Subplots in fiction bolster the main plot. They allow creators to make more complex, challenging, and satisfying art. But my point here is that plots and subplots are most effective when they're complementary, rather than when their actions detract from one another. So what you're saying is that Fallout 4 sucks because it can't tell a story? No, not at all. In fact, I'd argue that Bethesda excels at telling stories, but tries to fit too many of them into one narrative space. Or that by trying to layer stories in inconvenient ways, they offer an experience that trades on the availability of any one story over another. And the kicker is that by no means are any of these stories bad. Sure, there are some that are a little meh or feel like they were thrown in as filler, but by and large, if you encounter a story in this game, it's pretty well put together. And where Bethesda's storytelling efforts really shine are in the scattered micro-stories of side quests and hidden-ish content. I'm about to get into some specifics here that might be a little spoilery. Nothing major, I promise, but if you want to stay completely blind, I'd recommend skipping ahead a bit. Specifically, I want to talk about 2 of my own experiences with these micro-stories, the Fenn Street Sewer and the Travelers in Concord. I'll try to keep these brief, but for me these stand out as solid examples of the micro-storytelling I mentioned. So let's go. The Fenn Sewer is a simple shoot-and-loot side quest with a handful of audio diaries scattered throughout. The diaries present a serial killer's final testament to the detective who's followed the killer's career and tracked him to his lair in the sewers. It's fairly bog standard for this particular type of game, with the added benefit of spooky, skeleton-filled tableaus set up nearby each new piece of audio. It's not exactly groundbreaking, but this is what I meant. The sewers are literally half a block away from Diamond City, but the story is only activated if the player makes the effort. You ask, you get, you immerse. You don't ask, you walk on by. I don't have an official name for this one, and some wicked mad Google foo turned up all a squat, so I'll do my best to describe the situation here. Early in my first playthrough, I encountered a group of 3 wanderers gathered around a campfire in Concord. 2 had one at gunpoint, accusing him of being a synth. At this point in the game, I was flying blind and I had no idea what synths were, and I had just found a potential murder about to go down. There was a scuffle, some limbs were lost, and a man walked free, but the NPCs refused to interact with me beyond asking for help, trying to kill me, or trying to kill each other. I was only really able to gather information in the moment by paying attention to how the characters interacted. I wasn't the most important person in the room, or at least not beyond my own interpretation of the situation. Afterwards, I was rewarded with a bit of direct story from the synth character and a cryptic hint. I need to get to Bunker Hill. This may not have been its own fully self-contained story, but it was still an isolated bubble that I had to choose to interact with. A story passively waiting for me to poke my head in, or not. And the most intriguing part of this situation, I haven't met another player who has had the same experience. This leads me to believe that the event isn't an automatic inclusion, and it might trigger randomly, or that it may happen whether the player is there to witness it or not. So it's not a full-fledged side quest, but it intrigued me. It made me feel seated in the world because suddenly I, as the player, wasn't the most important thing on the planet. There was a world that happened without my interaction, and it made me feel small. It made me feel alone. but in a good way. So where does this leave my argument? Does Fallout 4 have a shitty story? Not at all. I said I enjoyed the whole package, and I mean that. Where my concern lies is the format. Fallout 4 sucks at telling a long-form, cohesive story because its own sandbox nature inherently conflicts with the idea of a directed narrative. Bethesda wants you to strap in and play the linchpin in an epically scaled story, but also to stop and wait around in their world, and you just can't. Or rather, it's not impossible, but everything comes at a cost. When we're asked to stop paying attention to an ostensibly time-sensitive story, it becomes that tiniest bit more difficult to stay immersed every time, to suspend disbelief and be the sole survivor. But in a world where that main course is eschewed, and the Commonwealth is digested in smaller bites, the world flowers. We're able to sink in and absorb the consequences of what's happened around us. We're able to see the lives affected by the world we're shown before the war, and the world that people live in now. And it's there, in the little polished gems that the player can choose to take or leave behind, that Fallout 4 really shines as a storytelling experience. When we take a backseat to ourselves and our direct involvement in Fallout's world, that's when we become a part of it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time. And remember, just because it sucks doesn't mean it's bad. Bye! Now that I've had my time to ramble like an asshole about wandering around the wastelands, I want to hear what all you think. Did I resonate? Did I strike a nerve? Was I dead wrong, or do you hate my guts now? Sound off in the comments and let me know.